Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, we're going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons design, and I thought the perfect person to do this was Kevin, or K.R King, over at D&D Homebrew. Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Fred. Great to be here.
So, Kevin, I know you have many videos, but you specifically have one video that talks about dungeon design. And I thought, well, you would be the perfect person to discuss this topic and explain dungeon design to people. So what are some of the key features to dungeon design when you're homebrewing and making your own dungeon?
Well, Fred, having had, been designing them since I was, 12 years old, first started the game. When I first started, we used to just start drawing on a piece of paper, right? And we would just draw rooms and connections and strange hallways and everything. And then as I became more sophisticated, I realized that what you always want to start with when you're thinking about the dungeon design is what is the purpose of this dungeon? Why did someone go through all the effort to dig out this area, or if there was an existing catacomb, another thing, but to create, stone walls, mortar, flooring, whatever, doors, rooms and whatnot. Why did they do this? So that's always the first thing that I always think about. And, I have a number, there's a variety of these. The classic dungeon that you see under a castle, for example, was a prison, right? Where they kept prisoners, they threw them in the dungeon, the classic thing. And you might have this in a city as well, a keep at the center of a city, but just for people that, committed crimes or ticked off the king or whatever. And so if I have a prison dungeon, I'm thinking about how would this be built? Obviously cells along hallways. And then I might have a center room from which you can get to these various hallways. Years ago, I designed a dungeon like a wheel, spokes of a wheel, and the wheels came out of a central room. And then I had a shaft because the entrance to a prison dungeon, just like a real life prison, it's hard to get in and out, right? Not easy access. And as opposed to, say, storage, where you're just storing wine, foodstuffs that can be stored underground, a root cellar, you're not going to have an elaborate security system. It's probably not going to be that big. Although you could have an elaborate wine cellar, elaborate storage area, an elaborate archive, again, and then depending on the value of it, how difficult. So when you're thinking about what is the purpose of this dungeon, that can help dictate the architecture of it, whether it's easy or hard to get in and out of, and also the size, because if you have a dungeon in which you're holding common criminals, and then you have some super criminal or some super creature, you might have a lower level, you might have a very specialized area. You might also have a creature that's just being held down there, but has water source or whatever. It's allowed to sort of live there. Again, you can start to get into fanciful prison dungeons, but again, the idea always is to prevent the creature or the inhabitants of that dungeon of easy access to the outside. Again, if the entrance to a prison dungeon, for example, is a portal or a gate, it can literally be on its own separate little area, whether that's a dimension, right? Or just it was cut out of the earth, sealed off, and people are sent there. Now, this is sort of a horrific idea because no, you're not going to live long there unless the wizard to torture them is sending food in and everything, and they're in this dungeon. And maybe they come out after a certain amount of time and get them out. But the main thing is with this is the purpose of it should dictate the architecture. So that's my first rule of dungeon design. So another classic dungeon is the tomb, right? Because we think about burying people in a tomb. In some ways, a pyramid is a dungeon above the ground, right? Because it did have shafts, it had rooms. You could also, and again, you can have an obelisk or something like that. So you can have a dungeon above the ground with a tomb in which someone was buried. And obviously this lends itself to ghosts and haunting and whatnot, but it also lends itself to treasure because oftentimes with a tomb, the person put there, first they're honored by the size of their tomb, the decoration within the tomb, artworks, gold, treasure, whatnot, things to take to the next world, this kind of thing, the classic Egyptian thing. And then these tombs attract, looters over history. Has the tomb been looted? There's nothing more exciting in D&D when you discover a tomb that has been lost to history, right? you realize no one has looted this tomb. Now, unlike real life, King Tut's tomb in D&D, it really is cursed, right? It really does follow you and haunt you, and all those that dare, and just some specter or some creature is going to follow you around to try to kill you. This is the great thing about tombs. And also you tend, because of the immortality of a tomb, to put guardians in the tomb. Things like, gargoyles are an obvious one. Golems are an obvious one. Any kind of construct, anything that's there all the time, animated armor. And then, of course, the traps and this is where you have pits that go into lava or something like that, because the people that were building this tomb wanted to protect the honor of their king or priest or whatever. So tombs are a classic of dungeon design. Typically, these are not going to be as big as, other forms. They're not often going to be a mega dungeon, but you can certainly have a tomb within a mega dungeon as a level, as an offshoot, as a secret area, and what you want to do is warn your players beyond this thing or the sacred tomb of whatever, because for me as a player and a GM, tombs can be very deadly. Why? Undead, technically a vampire lives in a tomb of some kind. And again, you have the vampire that can fly out at night through some air shaft or something, but lives in this tomb, and all that kind of stuff with tombs. It's just such a classic of D&D. And again, when you design that tomb, think about the sort of things that would be in there and the idea that it might be haunted. So another classic sort of dungeon-esque sort of thing is a sewer system, right? Now this would be underneath a city. They built the sewers, and it all leads out to the sea. But in D&D, all sorts of things can live in the sewer. Giant rats, were-rats, you might have thieves, this sort of thing. And the other thing that you can have with sewers is connections to like storerooms under buildings. There's a drainage thing, and someone has modified this or whatever so they can climb in and out of the sewer system. You can have these where there's ways to get, if players are trying to break into something, they go through the sewer system, find their way into a room within the bottom of a keep or something like that. Because sewers, obviously, you want to be connected to a sewer if you've got one in your town, because all your waste and everything goes out, and you're not just dumping it out into the street. So this connection then means like the classic, air shaft in every James Bond movie, right? Where they climb through the air shaft and find their way. Well, a sewer system is kind of that in a medieval sense. Now, how elaborate? I believe the sewers of Paris are very ancient. I believe there were elaborate sewer systems, but again, it's a fantasy game, right? You can create all sorts of, some bullywugs or something like that, find their way into a sewer system or whatever. I mean, you can have different, and these can be vast too, right? And I believe sewers can have multiple levels. I'm not absolutely positive. I mean, and again, you can just have long shafts, not a lot of rooms in a sewer system. And then maybe they go into a cave system. This is the next thing I'm going to talk about. When you have a dungeon, you can have it connected to caverns. And there's two ways I think about this. One is there's a cavern and somebody sees this and says, hey, I'm going to create a dungeon. These caverns are underneath my keep on the lonely peninsula, right? So they break in and they modify and put walls up. But the other thing is you've got an existing dungeon and something like a Umber Hulk tunneling along, breaks through the wall, boom, you've got an entrance in that dungeon to the Underdark or to some cavern, however elaborate you want to make. And it can make perfect sense. So you've got one little area here. And what this does is it gives the players an opportunity. They clean out the dungeon. They go to the tomb, they clean out the tomb, but you've got a little, I often make it a pool. Water is a great source because water always flows through things. And they can decide, do we want to go for it? We finished off with the tomb. It looks like it's done. Something's been by there, and then it's had a little cave in. But you can see there's been a cave in, something went by. And if they start to dig, they expose what's clearly an Umber Hulk. And of course, they could run into Umber Hulks, but it might be really old. Another thing that you can do with the catacomb is lava tubes, things like that, where you've got these long, elaborate holes. And what that does is it creates something a little different. You can have all these, because the lava will make all sorts of elaborate things, and things will live in there, right? In real life, people didn't live so much in caves, but animals certainly do. Animals use caves all the time. Another one is a gateway dungeon. This is where it is a dungeon built specifically either to provide a gateway to another plane, another area on the material plane, or to prevent people from getting through there. Something has created a gate and it's not a good gate. It's to some hellish dimension or someplace. And so they have created protectors, right? So, and the gateway can also be the gateway to a prison dungeon, right? So you've got a dungeon on some plane for very high level prisoners. And here is a little dungeon that was built with a gateway that leads to this prison dungeon. So again, you can mix and match these. Another classic dungeon, the mine shaft, right? When people were mining for things, salt mine or gold mine or whatever. And of course, you've got elaborate areas. How much you want to get into the, what do you say, steampunky kind of thing where how much mechanism. I would tend to think of a medieval dungeon as having very crude. I don't know if they really used track. Maybe they did use tracks because that's what then led to the steam engine. So maybe they did have some kind of tracking to haul stuff out. But mainly with those, you've got the wooden structures we all saw in like The Hobbit with the goblins, that sort of thing. We've all seen with Indiana Jones and that kind of thing where you can have, if you want to get into that and have some fun with that, you can. But again, mine shafts, they'll have shafts that go straight down with just, a crude elevator that runs operations. Sometimes they'll have, a ladder or something between them. And those can be very risky to do. And those will be mainly, you can have flying creatures, things that can get in and out of those mine shafts very easily, as opposed to people living there. The next major topic that I would talk about in terms of designing dungeons is it a working dungeon? Is it still operating for the purposes that it was built? Or is it a dungeon that is no longer working for those purposes, but has now been occupied by something else? So in other words, a tomb has been looted, and now it is the lair of some creature that says, hey, look at this. This is a nice little area. It's got an entrance here. I can get out. I can hunt. And now you can combine those. The lair has at the back of the tomb was some hidden secret door that the creatures, let's say some trolls live there, and they're not smart enough to figure out what this thing is. Maybe they worship. They can feel the magic behind the thing, but they don't know what it is. So the players come along, they kill the trolls, and they see this thing, and then they have an access to a tomb, right? So you can combine those. But the lair is a classic way to sort of introduce, if you want to introduce a larger dungeon, but also it can just be the creatures took it over, right? The abandoned keep, it's no longer used as a prison. The keep is just crumbled, but things live in the dungeon underneath. This is, I think, where the non-working dungeon, prison dungeon, sort of was the first dungeon in the original Dungeons and Dragons, right? You always had like the ruined keep outside of town, and adventurers would go out there and begin to explore the dungeons beneath the keep, right? You can also, in terms of a repurposed dungeon, this is sort of repurposing when you have a haunted dungeon. So you have a thing that once lived there, that once worked, this was their keep, this was their dungeon, they've long ago perished, but their spirit lingers on somehow. And oftentimes, the ghost rules, those are a whole nother video in themselves about rules about ghosts. But certainly the haunted dungeon is, it is the former owner, who's still hanging around in some form, but the dungeon itself is not under his control. It's not a working dungeon anymore. You can also have a dungeon that is a religious shrine, that sort of thing, where you have active people there, worshiping some god or whatever, or holding secret rites, right? It's a forbidden religious temple. And again, that can be repurposed by other creatures. And then you can have, artifacts of this religious rite or this secret thing that you could relate to other storylines, other aspects. And this is a kind of story treasure, as I call it, that can lead to other things by the players coming in. And I don't know if you do this, Fred, in your game, but I always have a thing where you kill an animal in the wilderness, you try to track it back to its lair, right? Because oftentimes its lair, it leads to something else. Not always. Sometimes a lair is just a lair. Sometimes it's just a cave. That's it. But it's a great device to use to link it to some dungeon, because anytime you have a well-constructed thing that's out of the elements, right? It's got a temperature control. You don't get wet. Creatures are going to want to live there. And so those layers become a natural, repository, as it were, for abandoned dungeons. Another dungeon concept is the flooded dungeon, right? Now you have water flowing underground, and sometimes you will have connectors. So an Umberhulk comes along, bursts through a dungeon, and there's some water source, it floods in, the dungeon is flooded up to a certain point. The players come, they see this dungeon is there. Do you want to go into the water? Right? I mean, not only do you got to get water breathe, it's dark, it's cold. I mean, with that water breathe, the temperature, the spells will help you. But it just adds that extra dimension of this flooded dungeon. And then you come to a certain area in the dungeon and it's not flooded anymore. So you're out of the water, right? As we've talked about in another discussion we had in terms of how much time do you want to spend, right, in that dungeon. Now you got to go through that flooded area. You got to have the spells or whatnot to get through the flooding area. So flooding a dungeon, or if you want to run an underwater campaign, you could just have dungeons that are just totally underwater. One of the things, underwater creatures, I guess you look through Merman or whatever, I guess aboliths have caverns and this sort of thing. You have to look through the list of those creatures that would have caverns underwater. That tends to be a very high-end sort of, like, you find out about it and you go there specifically. You don't typically just stumble across some vast underwater dungeon. Another kind of dungeon is the archive. And this is a dungeon in which someone has placed very valuable material. These might be books. These might be, it could be magic items. They could be formulas for things. They could be information. They could be things that this person was trying to save, and they've kept them into this very safe area, typically small, and maybe it's been lost to history or whatever. And again, the players come across this and they get information. And an archival dungeon may have a guardian. It may have some construct or some gargoyle type thing. But the main thing with an archival dungeon to me is it gives the players story treasure. It gives them ideas or things. It can have some actual treasure too, but it gives them information that's very valuable and valuable to very high level or potentially deadly things that are searching for that. The legendary mega dungeon, right? This is the dungeon that we all ran in those glory days of D&D, and I guess still run. You yourself did the Dungeon of the Mad Mage with 23 levels. Now, these are the one dungeon that I would say don't have to make sense. In other words, yes, they might have some purpose, but I have found it difficult to really explain the purpose of a 23 level dungeon, in terms of maintaining it, in terms of getting in and out of it. And you know what? It's a game. We're having fun. It's just a dungeon. Sometimes a dungeon and just have the mega dungeon. I always use the wizard or the great figure that was powerful and wanted to demonstrate their power with their vast, elaborate labyrinth. Or they put mazes in and things like that to test people. So they would entertain themselves by watching people try to find their way through these. So they would watch and they would have scrying devices and whatever. So that was kind of my explanation in the past. But I take it you have one as well?
I do. As it happens, as you know, I am running through Dungeon of the Mad Mage. I have not actually completed all 23 levels. It would take many years, I suspect, to actually complete Dungeon of the Mad Mage. We've done the first 2 levels. But the explanation for why the mega dungeon exists, there is 2 that I can think of easily, but there probably could be more. And that is, whoever created this or owns the dungeon, it's usually a mad mage. Halaster Blackcloak is a good example of Undermountain. There's no rhyme or reason to what he's doing, and whatever reason he has wouldn't make sense to anybody else other than to him. Often, in Dungeon of the Mad Mage, he has 6 different goals, of which many of them clash with each other. Hence, mad as a hatter. The Mad Lich, liches live such a long time, their rationale for why they do something would not be clear to mortal men and women. And then the dragon that's lived for many years, who carves out their own dungeon with multiple levels that they live in. They don't need to have a reason that makes sense to anybody other than to them. So I think that's one of the good aspects to finding a reason why the mega dungeon exists.
We have a tradition, I'm sure you have it in England and the United States, of architectural follies where you have some super rich person who designs their own house and just keeps adding rooms and this and that. And the architects are just like, this is insane. It's all these different styles, and they fire them and they do it themselves. And then you end up with this massive house. Now, a lot of them have been torn down over the years because they are sort of dysfunctional or whatnot. But certainly the classic mad mage, demigod, whatever, and things that live a long time have time to build stuff, because that's a whole nother question.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for being on the show for today.
Fred, as always, great to be here. Loved it.
So if you're interested in Kevin or K.R King or D&D Homebrew, go and check out his channel. It's down in the description. I will also link his video where he talks about dungeon design. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.